Assalamu alaikum students. The topic that we are going to discuss today is different fields in which psychology is applied, or in other words, different branches of psychology. There are various fields in which psychology is applied. Nowadays, the scope of psychology has increased a lot. Let's have a look at some of the important branches of the subject. Clinical psychology. One of the most important branches in psychology is clinical psychology. That branch studies the individual's mental and behavioral disorders, identifies their causes and types, and carries out the classification of mental disorders. It also involves the diagnosis and treatment of the disorders. To become a clinical psychologist, one has to do a diploma or PhD in clinical psychology after completing master's program in psychology. Clinical psychology is concerned with mental disorders. Apart from collecting data about patients' motives, emotions, inclination, clinical psychologists are performing other duties as well, such as classification of mental illnesses, diagnosis, treatment, and research. One of the important objectives of a clinical psychologist is the classification of mental illness. To collect the complete and detailed information about the mental illness, and only after in-depth study of the classification of mental disorders, clinical psychologists can enter upon the next phase. There has been many misconceptions about mental disorders in the past. People with mental illnesses were treated inhumanly. They were treated by magic or exorcism, or they were subjected to physical torture, and they were believed to have been possessed by some evil spirits. All these inhuman concepts prevailed till Renaissance. In 16th century, humanistic theories and approaches were emphasized, and gradually different dispensaries and hospitals were set up to treat psychological illnesses. In this regard, American Psychiatric Association APA has introduced an authorized system of classification of mental disorders or diseases, which is known as Diagnostic and Statistical Manual DSM. DSM 4TR, which is the fourth edition and was published in 1994, is available for the clinical psychologist, from which they can consult for the diagnosis and treatment of different mental problems. Some of the important mental disorders are anxiety disorders, somatoform disorders, dissociative disorders, personality disorders, mood disorders, schizophrenias, and other psychotic disorders. The second important objective of a clinical psychologist is to make diagnosis. Now, diagnoses are of vital importance because only after a proper, accurate, and precise diagnosis is made, the treatment can be done. There are generally two procedures which are adopted for diagnosis. First is diagnostic or clinical interview, and the other one is psychological test. Diagnostic or clinical interview is done or made in clinics where a psychologist enters into a conversation with the patient and inquires about the condition and nature of the diseases by knowing the symptoms and other indications of the diseases. The information given by the patient is then confirmed or verified by the family members. And this is also known as a case study method or case history method. The second procedure is psychological test. Depending on the nature of the symptoms and conditions, different psychological tests are conducted, and these tests facilitates the diagnosis of the illness. Now comes the most important duty of a clinical psychologist, which is the treatment. Different methods for treatments are used. Considering the nature and severity of the disorder, clinical psychologist prescribes proper treatment. The method used in clinical psychology for the treatment of a disorder is usually called psychotherapy. Psychotherapy could be individual or it could be done in group. Psychotherapies can also be classified as directive or non directive. Various therapeutic techniques or methods belong to different school of thoughts that different psychologists have suggested, like psychoanalysis that belong to the psychodynamic school of thought, behavior therapy suggested by behaviorists, gestalt therapy, humanistic therapies, and cognitive behavior therapies. Apart from these methods, there are other various therapies as well which take into account the nature of the disorder as well as the patient's circumstances. In some cases, patients' family members are also called in for treatment, which is known as family therapy. In Pakistan, there are various clinics and hospitals, both in government and public sector, who are working in this field and providing services. The fourth important objective of a clinical psychologist is research. Research is like the lifeblood in any field. Research facilitates discovery of new methods of diagnosis and treatment. Research itself is not a branch, but it is a process. It is only due to research that psychology has been developed into a scientific field. New theories, therapeutic methods, and psychological tests are being brought out daily for the betterment of people. Talking about our second very important branch in psychology, which is educational psychology. Educational psychology is the branch of psychology which deals with the teaching and learning and all the problems that are related to the field of education. The branch of knowledge that through the application of methods based on psychological principles brings about a disciplined change in the behavior of students is called educational psychology. The role of educational psychologist depends on three important factors: to determine the objectives in the field of education, to determine the criteria and content, and to develop the methods of teaching, not only teaching but also the methods of assessment as well. In education, objectives should be determined. Educationists identify the general and particular goals. Thoughts to transfer the thoughts, beliefs, values, and moral values and customs of ancestors to their new generation is known as the journal objective, while to determine the curriculum in education and to determine what changes individual will undergo after having gone through the syllabus, which of the talents will be registered improvement are known as some of the specific objectives. In addition to this, experts also determine that what can be taught to a child at what age. What are the general criteria for a particular skill? Educational psychologist identifies the nature and syllabus of training for every age. That is when the potential of the child develops fast, when he can learn relatively more difficult skills, which topics are important for what age, and so on. Educational psychologists not only determine the criteria and content but also detail the methods whereby that syllabus is to be taught to students. Methods of examinations, assessment of question papers, semester or annual system, all these issues are decided in accordance with the syllabus. Teaching methods holds a great importance in educational field. The way the children, particularly those studying at different age groups, are taught in different ways. Different methodologies adopted in colleges and universities, and similarly, different teaching methods are there for slow learners. So, teaching methodology, all types of students, slow, dull, intelligent, gifted, they're all catered. Syllabus and teaching methods are designed according to the IQ level of the child. It is arranged to provide special education for mentally retarded children as well. Now we have seen that there are separate institutes that have been set up for the education and training of special children. In addition to this, experts look to the journal criteria for the development and growth of children. In addition to this, psychology makes sure that children also get instruction in co curricular activities as well, like speeches, dramas, sports, fine arts, and other organizational skills. Another important duty of educational psychologists is to probe into the problems of educational life and suggest solutions to them as well. In this regard, both teachers and students are important pillar of educational structure, and it is duty of educational psychologists to identify emotional, social, psychological problems of students. Also, to solve the social and psychological problems of teacher. Moving on to our another important branch of psychology, which is industrial psychology. The branch of psychology that deals with the human aspect of industry is known as industrial psychology. We have seen that the present age is the age of industrial development, and importance of industrial psychologists have increased a lot. Some of the important duties of an industrial psychologist are to select personnel, to improve working conditions, to promote trade and industry, to inquire into matters related to industry, to enhance the demand of the product through advertisement, to work out the strategies for carrying products to the market, to devise ways to boost employees' morale, to formulate strategies to prevent lockouts and strikes, to make efforts to establish and maintain good relationship among key groups. Now talking about the key groups, there are three important key groups in industry: employer, worker, and consumer. Employer is the person who sets up an industry, who invest money and expects profit on his investment. Employer recruits personnel to run his industry. An industrial psychologist helps the employer in recruitment of the personnel. The second important pillar in industries is worker. Workers are the backbone. They provide their services, their duties to manufacture quality product and to increase the production. Now it is up to the administration to provide them a very reasonable and feasible working condition so that the production is at its maximum. The responsibility to act on these recommendations lies within employer and administration. The third important pillar, consumer. Consumer are the people who consume the end product or buy the end product. They're also very important because if they boycott or refuses to buy a product, the industry suffers a lot. The industrial psychology, as I said earlier, helps in the recruitment of a personnel. Industrial psychologists, keeping in view the nature of the job, establish a criteria for hiring a worker. What should be the qualification, education, physical fitness of a of a person, a suitable who is suitable for a certain or particular post. For that, different psychological tests are conducted for the recruitment. Interview is one of the important criteria or method of selection of a personnel. The right person for the right job, if assured, can help a lot. Otherwise, a number of problems arises. Industrial psychologists are also involved in the advertisement of the product. They manage public opinion and manipulate it through ads, and people are induced to buy products. So, industrial psychologist introduces innovations in advertisements. Next come another important task or objective of industrial psychologist, which is to make sure a very good working condition. The industrial psychologist tries his utmost to create better working condition for the workers. The safety is a top priority to make sure that all the precautionary measures are taken to avoid any sort of accident. Beside this, fresh air, proper light, sufficient water, and adequate short breaks to make sure that they are not unrested. It's also very important. And these things inspire workers to work devotedly. It is also important to boost the morale of the worker because in such case they work with devotion and bring about increase in production. Morale and working conditions both are interrelated. Morale can be boosted by providing the workers with good benefits, increments, salary rise, giving them breaks, providing them with good packages, and so on. Under better working conditions, morale is high and production goes up, whereas under adverse working condition, morale goes down, so does production. To avoid industrial accidents, industrial psychologists work in a way so that efficient and responsible people are recruited and the risk of industrial accidents is decreased. Industrial psychologists provide against such accidents which are caused by incompetent or inefficient people. These days, every industry has started to hire a personal officer or industrial psychologist, and consequently, the demand of industrial psychologists has increased in the country. Another field which is related to industrial psychology is the business psychology. If a person has to set up a business, it is very important to make a careful planning prior to starting any business. For example, which products are in demand in which area, where to get the raw material from, where the workers are easily available, and what arrangements should be made in place for carrying manufactured goods or products to the market, which other people or departments can be helpful in running the industry successfully, etc. All aspects of business and the whole range of human problems related to it come within the scope of business psychology. Apart from the factors mentioned above, the principles of industrial psychology also apply to it. In fact, industrial psychology covers the human factor in industry, whereas business psychology also includes the phase of starting an industry in business. Moving on to our another important branch of psychology, which is experimental psychology. Talking about psychology as a science, we cannot avoid the importance of experiments in it. In fact, it's the experiments that provided a scientific basis for this subject. William Wundt was the first formally initiated experiments in psychology in 1879 when he set it up the first laboratory at Leipzig in Germany and included subjects in experiment after giving them proper training. Today, there is no developed country that does not have sophisticated labs. And in these labs, individuals' mental processes and behavior are studied with utmost objectivity. In laboratories, number of experiments are conducted on learning, perception, illusion, memory, emotion, motivations, and sensation. In addition to this, experiments are carried out in these labs to make further progress in the work on the measurement of intelligence, performance, and incarnation. Apart from human beings, animals are also subject of experiment. The scope of experimental psychology is very vast because it is not a separate branch of psychology. In fact, to conduct experiment is just one of the methods of study and research which every branch of psychology is successfully using to deduce ever new results. Another important branch, which is called environmental psychology. While studying the individual's mental processes and behavior, his genetic traits and environments cannot be avoided because environment holds a great importance in psychology. however short-lived the individual's behavior may be, takes place in some environment. In other words, there must be some background for a behavior to occur, and this background is defined as environment. Environment is important because behavior takes place in it. No interpretation of human behavior is acceptable as long as it is not analyzed with reference to environment. So, we can define environmental psychology in which the individual is studied with reference to his environment. We study not only what is in how environment influence a human behavior, but we also study the branch of psychology that looks into the individual's behavior and mental processes are influenced by his general environment. Not only this, that how environment influences human behavior, but also how human behavior influences environment and surroundings. As we have seen that over the years, different environmental issues like air, noise pollution are also taken into regard. Another important branch. Let's talk about another branch of psychology, which is correctional psychology. Before talking about correctional psychology, let's define criminal psychology. The branch of psychology that conducts the psychological study of personality and behavior of antisocial elements and lawbreakers is called criminal psychology. And the branch of psychology that suggests measures for the correction and rehabilitation of lawbreakers and antisocial elements is known as correctional psychology. The experts in criminal psychology analyze the personal traits of criminals through measurement of their personality and seek out the reasons for the violation of law. They also help to guide people suffering from psychological disorders and drug addicts. Correctional psychologists work for the welfare and betterment of criminals and help them to learn skills according to their talent and resources so that they may become responsible citizens after release from prison. Criminal psychology studies crime and motives behind it. According to Taft, any violation of law falls under crime. The person charged with violation of law is called accused, whereas criminal is the person whose crime has been established or proved in a court of law. There are different factors into classification of a crime. According to law, crimes are of two types: minor crimes and serious crimes. And according to motives, crimes are divided into types like economic crimes, sexual crimes, political crimes, and other crimes. After classification of crimes, it is important to know what is meant by criminal law. The rules that regulate human behavior and are enforced by a political authority are called law. These rules apply to all citizens without any distinction of color, race, and creed, and their violation is subject to punishment. There are numerous types of criminals around us, like traditional criminals, accidental criminals, situational criminals, professional criminals, criminals involved in breakdown of law and order, psychological criminals. There are different therapeutic techniques which are applied by correctional psychologists to treat maladjustment among prisoners. Beside all these steps, psychologists tell us about precautionary measures for the prevention of crime as well. Moving on to our another important branch of psychology, which is known as guidance and counseling psychology. Individuals, when after coming to the world, need to adjust to their environment, and during this process, they face many different problems. The branch of psychology that helps ordinary people to tackle their everyday problem is called counseling psychology. Counseling is a continuous process, and every normal person at different stages of their life encounters different social, psychological, emotional, and educational problems. like misunderstandings or difficulty in selection of a subject, or maybe some family matters or disturbances. In such matters, help is sought from those who have expertise, and such persons are called counselors or guides. In counseling, individuals are helped out of their problems in an organized way. Let's define guidance and counseling separately. Guidance refers to the process of extending help to normal people under some guidance institute so that they are able to see their potential as well as realize how they can develop it effectively. While counseling is a process in which, when a normal person is unable to solve his problem on his own, he consults a counselor who helps him to solve those problems. Counselor gives indirect and unobtrusive counseling to the client so that he is able to deal with his problem on his own. The important objectives of counseling and guidance are to enhance self confidence, self efficacy, self realization, better adaptation to the environment, and control over psychological complexes, training in handling problems, and elimination of prejudices, and professional guidance, etc. We have different types of counselors, like educational counselors who work for different educational institutes. Then we have social counselors and psychological counselors. Some of the important qualities of a counselor are sympathy, reliability, tolerance, self awareness, broad mindedness, cheerfulness, cleanliness, innovation, organized, and so on. Guidance is also of vital importance in education, and students of different ages and levels are provided guidance according to their abilities and environment. Another important branch of psychology, which is developmental psychology. Developmental psychology deals with all the different aspects of development and changes that occur during a lifespan. There are separate branches of psychology for every phase of life. Child psychology, which deals with the childhood phases. Then we have psychology for adolescents, adult psychology, and psychology of aging. In all these branches of psychology, different phases and aspects of development and their problems are studied. Developmental psychology deals with the aspects like physical development, psychological development, social and cognitive development, emotional and language development. Talking about child psychology, this branch of psychology studies all the phases from birth till adolescence. It studies children's physical, mental, social, and moral development as well as their function under the following periods, which are prenatal development, infancy, toddler, early childhood, middle childhood, and late childhood. Child psychologists also study the changes that inheritance and environment bring about in child's behavior. So, development is also determined by the genetic material inherited and the environment in which a child is brought up. Environments can be divided into two kinds for the sake of study, which are prenatal and postnatal environment. Today we discussed about different branches of psychology, and we just saw in detail that how these branches are working and how different psychologists are working in various fields.